will be recorded, and it is starting now. And we will place this on our YouTube channel as well as on our websites for future viewing if you have any interest. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my partner at CPES, Dr. George Berkowitz, who will do the introductions of the speakers this morning, and we are on our way.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I will try not to go over top in introducing the two speakers, but that's difficult given their background, given my familiarity with them. You're in the presence of some really fine, great people, technically as well as personally. First of all, Bruce Groves. I've been asking Bruce to give basically a reprise of one of the presentations that I saw relative to air quality at the micro level rather than the regional level, and how that may impact environmental decisions in terms of siting facilities in the future. And we will refer to environmental justice. And oh, by the way, we had an hour hot topic on environmental justice, which was great. And in case you people don't know that there's a law in the state of New Jersey about environmental justice, you sure will know. Deb, Bruce's was well, Bruce, I'm going to say you were the founder of Emilcott. Is that right?
Yes, Emily and Scott are my first two children, so that's where that brilliant name call. You know, we spent lots of money on a consultant to try to come up with that.
Well, CPES is a totally owned subsidiary of PB&J, and I will tell you what PB&J stands for later, and it's not peanut butter and jelly. So Bruce has been. I've had the fortune of working with Bruce on at least a couple projects. He is the go-to guy as far as I'm concerned when it comes to air issues, whether it's indoor or outdoor. Deb is somebody that I bumped into as when I was consulting on a project at Honeywell. Totally impressed with Deb's ability, her diplomacy, her skills, and her mannerisms and character. And I could go on and on and on and on, and I'm not going to because, but I do hold these people in the highest regard. I appreciate their contributions to this program. You think you're going to learn something that you probably have not really even considered about micro contamination at the local level, particularly when it comes to air issues. So Bruce, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I want to thank you once again profusely.
All right, I'm going to kick up the slides here. You know, all right, I'll try again here. So let me just try this one more time.
You were good. You just need to click on the start slides.
Yeah, right.
So I can always tell a story is that Emilcott has had a technology side. And I remember giving a presentation one time, actually to the post office. And we were going to talk about how great we were in attention to details. I could never get the projector to work, you know. So needless to say, we never got the project here. And let me just kick in here, open.
Share screen.
Share screen. All right, we got it now. So let me get back to share screen. All right, we there?
So far, yeah, there you go now.
Okay, all you do is go to slideshow and start slides. You're good to go.
Got it. Slideshow from the
beginning. Yeah.
All right, a little background about me, and Deborah can give a little background when she gets on because she has a much more lengthy CV than I do. I've been in the air business for over 40 years. I started as an OSHA inspector, as an industrial hygienist. So I know the health and safety side and the worker side. And so I always come from the ground up when it comes to air quality versus the ethereal types that kind of come from the high sky and come down. So we're meeting in the middle. So as when it comes to the local environmental impacts, this is something that I've been dealing with for many years. and got involved in air monitoring, pretty much perimeter air monitoring back in the beginning of this century, okay, the early 2000s, where we started to put together. In fact, one of the first areas that we were looking at was Ground Zero, when you had all the issues dealing with the fires. And we never, unfortunately, got involved in putting the system there now at that point. But we actually did quite a bit of work starting actually at the Honeywell project about 3 or 4 years later. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the moving pieces here in the community air monitoring programs. Deb Barsotti and I were one of 7 people on a DEP committee that was formed over 3 years ago now. And we have put together a guidance document that hasn't seen the light of day in the last year and a half because of COVID. But it's my understanding that this guidance document, the perimeter air monitoring guidance document, is going to come out sometime in the first quarter of next year. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the technology, some of the driving forces, and also give you a glimpse. We have a gag order. We're not allowed to talk about the details of this guidance document until it becomes much more vetted and formalized within the process. But we're going to give you some kind of direction and insight of where it's probably going to go. Okay. What are some of the challenges that are out there? One of the things that I think is important is that air, unlike water and soil and a lot of things, air for the most part has not had a lot of regulatory pushes at the local level. You have, of course, your Clean Air Acts and the Ambient Air Quality Acts and everything else.
Is it okay if we take a meeting in here or?
Yeah.
So you're starting to see that there's been some state by state actions, and I think one of the things that's been a dilemma is that because there's been no consistent policy and approach, you do have different requirements and different what is known as standard of care at the various states. So when that happens and there's a little bit of an anarchy, certain things can happen. And so what's driving the change in community air monitoring, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the data that's coming out there that's not related necessarily to regulatory pushes. And I'll give you some experience from, I think we have done hundreds and hundreds of these CAMP programs, these community air monitoring, perimeter air monitoring programs. This is an interesting slide of a technology that is a company in the West Coast that partnered with Google, and they put a little bit of an air lab in the back of one of these Google trucks that drives around all the streets to take pictures, when you have Google Maps and you have everything else, if you've seen these. And it is, to me, there's some flaws in this area because you're dealing with a capture, a snapshot in time of when this truck goes by. But their point is they're doing urban mapping to kind of get a visual approach to show where the local ambient air quality is. And then if you lay on some of the communities, the overburdened communities out there and some of the impacts, the whole issue is to try to get some policy pushes that, yes, that we have data showing that there's some bad, in this case, they focus on particulates, they focus on carbon, some of the primary pollutants, but so it's just kind of an interesting technology that's out there. Here's another one that this is a group called Purple Air, and what you're dealing is crowdsourcing of data, and this crowdsourcing of data. This happens to also be at the San Francisco Bay, and I took this when the wildfires were going, because you started seeing. In this case, this is PM 2.5. So particulate matter, which is looked at as in the respirable fraction. These are inexpensive particulate monitors. You buy them for $100 or $150. You now have a Wi-Fi hookup. It goes to a central data server. And so you see all the different numbers out there, and they've gotten very popular. And the point I'm trying to make is when you start seeing regulatory or guidance document, real science slowing down, often what happens is that you have this consumer push that says, geez, I'm not getting it from the regulatory folks. I'm going to buy my own meter. And you start looking at data like this, it can be very, very powerful with regards to putting pressure on people to say, well, there is some local environmental health impacts that have to be addressed. The other is and Deb actually pulled this together, but I'll do the best I can to try to go, is that, when you start looking at the environmental justice side of things, you are getting some correlation between those overburdened communities and pollution and disease. And that's the kind of the underlying fact of, and some of the policy pushes in environmental justice, is that there are real correlations between people who are living in areas that are, that have pollution of many ways. We'll focus on air, and showing that not just disease like asthma and some other respiratory pulmonary function type issues, but also they're focusing on COVID. So part of the areas is that, some of the people of color, some of these areas, the instance of higher COVID, which could be related to a lot of things, but it also correlates to bad local environments where people live. So you start looking at, and we actually put this slide together because we're doing quite a bit of work in the coal ash side of things. And coal ash is a good example, like hexavalent chromium was in Hudson County, and manufactured gas plants have been throughout, where you have these old legacy industrial areas where, in the case of coal ash, you have communities that have now started to encroach on what were rural areas where they had these coal ash ponds, these coal-fired power plants that would put the coal ash from the burning of coal into basically a big landfill. And the actual chemical makeup of coal ash is the concentration of what's left from the coal that hasn't burned. And so you got a whole potpourri of different metals. So one of the areas that we're involved in community air monitoring is this a hazard to people on site, but is it also a hazard to these adjacent areas that have now encroached or gotten close to the coal ash pond? So this is where we've gone. This slide right here, just graphically, we don't get involved. You can see where it gets concentrated colors. That's not a good thing, okay? Just to let everybody know. And the first one is you start looking at overburdened communities on the left side right here in New Jersey. You start looking at contaminated sites per square mile in New Jersey. And I'll have to move this here. And you start looking at cancer incident rates in New Jersey. And if in the simple correlation that we have here is that where you have overburdened communities and you have contaminated sites, you also have some higher concentration, higher densities of disease. So what triggers the need for perimeter air monitoring? There's certain things that clearly have triggered this. And when you start looking at this guidance document, one of the things that's going to trigger the guidance document is any type of remediation. This is going to be in New Jersey, any type of remediation. There's some boundaries put on it, but where the difference is going to be is often it was not a default that you had to do air monitoring on a site. You basically had to, in the past, you would identify that yes, there could be an issue dealing with emissions, and therefore we had to make a determination, do we want to do air monitoring? Okay, that was kind of the air monitoring wasn't required unless you felt there was a hazard. It's kind of flipped this way in that with the new guidance document, they're basically going to say it's assumed that you have to conduct air monitoring. So part of the nature of doing the work plans, doing some of the risk work that you're doing, you have to either say, no, you don't have to do air monitoring because, and support it from a real good scientific approach. So with a default, air monitoring must be done. You have to put a level of effort and document it that certain air monitoring does not have to be done because of whatever conclusion you have. So that's a complete shift to basically say the default has to have something, and you have to come up with a real good defensible position in order for not to do it, or you got to kick into the community air monitoring requirements. So we have here a number of different areas of what would trigger perimeter and community air monitoring. We're going to talk a little bit about what actually would entail if indeed your project requires this. Some of the key steps in air monitoring plans, these are 5 basic areas. The first is the whole aspect of developing a conceptual site model for airborne contaminants of concern. This is actually something many times have been completely passed by, where you say, well, we're doing air monitoring, and therefore we're going to put a particulate monitor out there, and we're going to put a VOC monitor, a PID, photo ionization detector, maybe we'll put a weather station, but there's no link between why are you doing this and what's the defensible position and getting data that is actually going to be useful. And that gets pulled together, and this is part of a rigorous plan that needs to be put together in a conceptual site model, which Deb's going to get in much more detail. The second is you also have to, as part of your conceptual site model, have to identify contaminants of concern, and there's a process for that. And then the third one, once you know what the chemicals are, what the contaminants are, you're going to have to establish some sort of health-based thresholds. And this is where it gets dicey, okay? Where coming from the OSHA business, we all know, or maybe a lot of us know, that OSHA has established, worker safety levels, permissible exposure limits. You know that the EPA has established reference standards for the public. So how do you correlate and how do you identify what are acceptable public health risk numbers for these various jobs? It's quite complicated. And again, since it's complicated, I'm going to give it to Dr. Barsotti. She's going to give a little more. The fourth area is, once you've understood and you have your conceptual site model, your contaminants of concern, you have established threshold levels, now you got to have your monitoring strategy. And the monitoring strategy, whereas it's air monitoring versus air sampling, you got to put them together. When we talk the term air monitoring, we typically are talking about real-time monitoring, some sort of instrument out there that gives you either a direct number, real-time, semi-real-time of what you're trying to identify, or you might have a surrogate, where you're you're concerned about lead, but you can't measure lead real-time, so you're going to determine how much dust is in the air with the correlation that you can understand what the relationship is to dust concentrations to your contaminant concern, lead being the example. And the last one is once you determine how you're going to monitor this real time, what sort of analytical methods are going to be necessary, where you send it to a laboratory and you start getting results on specific contaminants. Once you've figured out conceptually what you need, then you have to actually pinpoint and say, I'm going to take samples here, 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 5 stations, 10 stations, 3 stations, whatever it happens to be. So these are the key steps in an air monitoring plan. Now, one of the things that Deb and I got involved with the DEP when we first started this this effort is they had a science advisory board, mostly academics, well-known people in the state that really grew up in dealing with analytical air sampling. You know, TO15, some of your analytical methods for various contaminants. And so the original approach was heavy laboratory analysis. Well, one of the things that we did is saying, that's great. You know, if I ran a lab, I'd be very happy about that. But it really doesn't do what we wanted to do to give the stakeholders who are running a project, who are involved, data that's real time, data that's useful on a hourly or daily basis to make decisions to try to reduce emission rates. So the whole aspect of trying to control environmental, any environmental pollution on a local is not to document what happened days previously, but to have some sort of mechanism to be able to see what people, you know, what emission rates or what potential exposures are, so you can control that in place. And that's where you get the best bang for the buck. But as you start bringing in this whole concept of real-time data, it gets much more complicated because you want to make sure that you have the solution that can actually help meet health-based criteria. And as I said earlier, a lot of people would just default in PID and particulate monitors, and it may not necessarily have a defensible position that this data is very useful and it's good data that can be used in order to actually reduce the emission rates and improve the environmental conditions and ultimately keep those contaminants of concern at levels below any sort of health risk threshold that you want to meet. So we really push the real-time monitoring, and when you start seeing that the push is like those two examples I gave in the beginning, the power of this crowdsourcing of particulate monitors when it starts getting green and then it goes red and then it goes purple. This is where you start seeing people that can actually make decisions on a real-time basis in order to have better health outcomes. The one area that we had spent a lot of time is quality assurance, QA/QC. When you start dealing with the mix between real-time data and analytical data, and why the Science Advisory Board really likes analytical data is because it is a rigorous QA/QC program, laboratory sampling, you got NIOSH methods, you got EPA methods, you know, these have been vetted quite a bit. So a big challenge with real-time data is to make sure that we have a good, robust QA program, so the data that we are generating on a real-time basis is defensible. Here's some of the work that, you know, Emilcott's been integrators. We've had this technology now since 2006 is when we kicked in. We've had iteration after iteration and such, but this just shows some of the technology with real time, where of course everything is now goes to your phone. And so if you have a site and you start tracking things, you can track, you can operate a piece of equipment from your phone, you can turn things on and off, you can get alarms, you can you know, do whatever you need on your phone, on your computer and such. So that's really the importance of making sure that the people who can make decisions have the data that's quality data at their fingertips when they can actually take some affirmative action. We also, from a customer report template, this just shows some of the existing technology, happens to be our technology, but you know, there's similar things out there that the real-time data actually does a nice job of showing flow of air and everything else when you start dealing with trying to document what's the impact on your site. So now I'm going to give this over to Deb, who can talk a little bit more about the conceptual site model. So, Deb, give you a little background of yourself too, if you could.
Sure. Good morning. I'm Deb Barsotti. I have my PhD in pathology, and I'm a board certified toxicologist. And for 30 years now, I've been basically putting together the data, the hard data that Bruce is talking about, that actual exposure. And what does that mean to an individual? What is the risk or hazard of that exposure? So putting the two pieces together and bringing the full picture to understand the impacts that air quality might have on community. As Bruce was saying, the key piece is development of a conceptual site model. Most of us know about that. In the environmental world, we know about groundwater, a conceptual site model as how, leaching, transport, whatever to the individual. So this piece is really focused, as Bruce was talking about, is when we're doing our remedial effort, what is evolving into the air, what is being emitted into the air, what's the nature of that, what's the magnitude of that, and where are those receptors, and particularly where are those sensitive receptors. So as Bruce was saying, we need to understand what chemicals are going to be there that could reach our sensitive receptors, children, the elderly, and what is that transport mechanism? Is it bound to particulates, where metals usually are, or polyaromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, or is it volatile? Is a volatile phase. And then we want to quantify that link of what that exposure is to those chemicals of concern to understand what the impact or potential impact of the emissions are on humans. Of course, we focus on the inhalation exposure route, whether it be particulate borne or volatile. And the key piece there is, what are the toxicity factors that we must look at to understand what the potential impact of that exposure could be? And we look at off-site receptors, although obviously on-site is important, but as Bruce was mentioning, that is an OHSA issue or for workers. And what we're really interested in is the impact at the fence line or beyond, where we have receptors that are not OHSA trained or regulated, that these people are just a community that are going about their business and living close to a source. So that's the importance of off-site receptors. And I can't tell you how many times when I go to a site, we start setting one of these proposals or programs up. And you look around the site and you say, okay, it's, an industrial location or something like that. I can guarantee you there's a child care center somewhere nearby in the basement of a church or whatever the case may be, you may not be aware of. And that is key because they're the most vulnerable children. And it's something you got to be aware of when you're looking at your program. It's not just commercial workers. It could be the child care that's in that basement. And the other issue is our chemicals. Most of our chemicals, particularly that we have encountered in these environmental programs, have either a non-cancer effect or a cancer effect. And you have to look at both. What is the most sensitive endpoint? Most of the time we think cancer could be, And that's can be the case, but often it could be a non-cancer endpoint. And so we have to look at both when we're looking at a plan to determine what are we going to be monitoring for, as Bruce was talking about, what health-based criteria are we going to monitor that we can be protective of for the given exposures that we're monitoring out of the site. The other issue is, as a conceptual site model, we have to recognize some chemicals are not just volatile, but they may be transported as both a volatile and a particulate bound component, and have to take that into account. And that's very important. I can tell you the big focus there is something like a semi-volatile organic that can do both. A good example of everyday common occurrence of that and related to like an MGP or a manufactured gas plant site is a naphthalene, that mothball odor that's consistent with some of the waste. And that can be volatilized or it can be particulate bound. And that goes into, as Bruce was talking about, how are you going to measure, what method are you going to use to measure and be able to technically have a sound monitoring result that you can rely upon to be able to evaluate if there's any potential health impact of these emissions on the community. You have to remember that the conceptual site model really is a cornerstone. That's where you start. You got to put the thought into that and not just merely, checking the box. It's more complex than that. And it's a key cornerstone. And it needs to be updated as you gather more data and more information to be up to date and be consistent. Could I have the next slide, Bruce? Here's a real difference. Bruce mentioned this, is what health-based criteria are we going to use so we're going to be monitoring that lab result against? And as Bruce mentioned, this is the big change. It's not OSHA. It is not OSHA. There are health-based inhalation toxicity criteria, and they can be orders of magnitude lower than OSHA PELs, and that's going to provide us an important dilemma in a sense to make sure that we're going to be able to meet those. And state-specific criteria will require you to set certain levels. New Jersey DEP, for example, sets cancer risk levels at 1 in a million. Very conservative, but that's what on a chemical by chemical basis. So that health-based criteria that we pick has to be a 1 in a million endpoint. And it has some challenges, and we'll get into that. If it's not a carcinogen, then it has to be hazard. It's called a hazard quotient, and that has to be equal to 1 or 0.1 if it's just a screening criteria. So there are a lot of technical challenges in selecting your monitoring and analytical methods, particularly when we come to these being able to comply and be able to see analytically these very low health-based criteria. And it's quite a technical challenge, and it's not merely a check the box exercise. And again, just a reminder, maybe this is me more than but I am constantly being challenged by regulators and being able to monitor both the particulate as well as the volatile fraction. And when it comes to something like a semi-volatile like naphthalene. So it's not just one or the other. There may be a chance that you need to prove which is the most sensitive. Is it the particulate fraction or the volatile fraction? You might have to measure both for a while to demonstrate that you're monitoring and measuring those fractions that people may likely be exposed to and have the highest toxicity. Can I have the next slide, Bruce? So what are those health-based criteria? Well, some states actually provide those standards on a web page, so you know what they are. And some programs have a risk tool that can actually generate them for you, so you don't have to calculate them yourself. And that's like EPA has on their webpage, there are the regional screening levels, or RSLs, has a tool there that's a calculator that you can set up your site-specific exposure assumptions, get away from these more conservative screening levels to be site-specific. The duration of your exposure, how long is your remediation going to last? How long are you operating your remedial effort? Is it an 8-hour a day, a 10-hour day? You can adjust those so you're not quite as conservative, but nonetheless, these are going to be usually low criteria, certainly a lot lower than OSHA. So on the EPA regional screening levels, or RSLs, there's generic tables that you can actually just look up where these conservative criteria are based on 10 to the -6 risk, which is the inhalation unit risk. And that's for New Jersey, that would be for applicable to projects that have a chemical that is classified as a carcinogen, but your project duration is greater than a year. So your remedial schedule, it lasts longer than a year. Then if your chemical or chemical of concern is a carcinogen, you have to look at that cancer. That's a requirement under New Jersey DEP, the cancer endpoint. However, if your project's less than 1 year, then you don't, you have what's called a reference concentrations. So if your COC is non-carcinogen, then you're looking at a reference concentration, not a risk-based issue. So those are important distinctions, but both need to be looked at. Bottom line, and you have to make sure your chemical, your PAMP addresses both of those potentials. Can I have the next slide, Bruce? So when we're getting our project specific, we ran our calculator and got our durations, project duration specific health-based criteria. That's what's going to be used to compare directly to your laboratory output, where you have a confirmation sample that you sent to the laboratory and you've got directly to those results. So those are the critical numbers. And then there's going to be another set of numbers that you don't want to get down to the point where you're being, the community's being exposed to those health-based numbers. You want to have a higher level, as Bruce was talking about, where you can manage exposures in the field using real-time monitoring. You can say, I'm going to stop exposures at this level before I get to my health-based number. And I'm going to start mitigating those exposures with foam, for example, for volatiles, dust suppression, whatever your methods are to in the field where you can manage those emissions. You want to make those action levels and be able to have an action before you hit these low critical health-based criteria. There's ways that these can be calculated based on your soil concentration in particulates and in volatiles, how much of your critical COC is as a % of your total volatiles. And that is a simple calculation that you can extrapolate what that might be. Could I have the next slide, Bruce? I'd be remiss if I did not, because I see this so often. when I go and review other perimeter air monitoring reports or people that are um, uh, providing data for community impacts on community, and how often I see the use of the OSHA criteria rather than these, I'm going to call them EPA or these lower health-based criteria. And just to show an example of the orders of magnitude difference, I'm going to use arsenic. I'm sure most of you have dealt with the arsenic issue and understand the way we look at arsenic, unfortunately, is that our background is actually a risk. And so it's very important to understand that, but not only that, I want to use it as an example. EPA type of risk assessment, a residential air standard, for example, would be 0.00065. That's 10 to the minus 6 risk to 0.065, which is 10 to the minus 4th risk. So you got a two orders of magnitude margin there with EPA's risk level. But you can see those are very low numbers if you had to go to your lab to try to be able to detect that. Getting a non-detect without being able to reach these levels is meaningless. You can't technically provide that assurance that you're to the stakeholders that you're being protective if your analytical method can't get down to the levels so you can say, you know, I made 10 to the, I can detect 10 to the minus 6 risk, and by the way, you're not being exposed to that. And EPA also has a composite worker, just the average person that's on site that's walking around, and it's a higher level, but still pretty darn low. And then if you move on to the OSHA criteria, you can just see the difference in the orders of magnitude, whether a permissible the OSHA permissible exposure levels, or PEL, or ACGIH's threshold limit value, the standard worker exposure types of levels we're talking about, just look how much higher they are than the EPA type of risk assessment and criteria that underlie the regional screening levels that we're required to address in a perimeter air monitoring program. Could I have the next slide, please? New Jersey DEP, and I see this quite frequently now, is something that other states may not have. That New Jersey DEP recognizes the non-chemical criteria, which is an ambient air quality standard for particulate matter 10. So you do need to make sure you are paying attention to that respirable material at a particulate matter of 10 that could be inhaled, but also it has a quality of life issue in regulation, and that's for odors. So odors are distinct from those critical health-based criteria. An odor doesn't necessarily, and often isn't, triggering an adverse health effect, but it is regulated, so odors can be regulated, and is a quality of life. So you're dealing with the odor threshold, which is a very broad order of probably 3 orders, could be 3 orders of magnitude between the individual that can be able to sense or smell an odor to those persons that can you know, really are pretty tolerant to an odor. And so it's a difficult moving criteria to try to address. But odors are becoming a very important issue. Again, I'm going to give the example of naphthalene, but also recently with cannabis growing facilities where there's a lot of odor complaints and not health or toxicity issues concerned. So it's a nuance that we wanted you to be aware of, that it's not just toxicity, but for New Jersey DEP, a quality of life concern, and which is difficult to basically be looking at an odor threshold. Um, Based on the New Jersey SAB comments on years ago when they originally came out with their draft guidance on perimeter air monitoring, their science advisor board wanted you to monitor your PM10 fraction. So it's recognized, and you can expect to see the need to at least monitor dust from the PM10 fraction, or have a reason, as Bruce was talking about, have a reason not, justification why you need not measure PM10. The SAB felt PM10 was the correct fraction. I can tell you some regulators want to see a PM 2.5 because that is associated with combustion products, not remediation dust emissions, but nonetheless, it has in regulators' minds a more direct relationship to impacted health. So at a more stringent level, so you may get a requirement or a request to measure not only PM10 but PM 2.5. And the PM10 National Ambient Air Quality Criteria is a 24-hour time-weighted average, and it's at 150 micrograms per cubic meter, and you can't adjust it like for 8 hours or 10 hours. At New Jersey DEP's SAB says you gotta be looking at 150 micrograms. And real-time monitoring is a challenge sometime if you're in a dusty environment where there's things going on at your perimeter, construction, for example, or just traffic. But just to recognize that that's going to be a requirement, at least a PM10 requirement, unless you can justify otherwise. Bruce, I think the next slide. I think some key things that we've come up with, just from the standpoint is community relations and important pieces. People do not want to see large plumes of dust coming across onto where they reside or where they work. So just enhancing dust control, keeping that dust down is a great effort in not only controlling emissions and exposures, but making people happy. And remember, you have to have on-site OSHA type of controls. But remember, for off-site, it's the EPA type, which is a totally different ball game. It's going to be, require much more complex and technically driven data collection. What we found is be transparent of your monitoring results and any data interpretations as you can. Be as open and transparent as possible with the community. We've also found that providing frequently asked questions, fact sheets to stakeholders is a useful tool. It can, suppress a lot of questions that people might have and give them, information, technically sound information that they can base their concerns on, so they can feel more comfortable. The other thing is there's a lot of times where there'll be a SharePoint or some sort of a web-based data that maybe it may not be enough just to have access there, but you might want to hold public awareness meetings and communications to be able to answer any questions people have periodically to show how your monitoring is compared to your risk-based or health-based criteria, that you're showing that your impacts are below those and that people can ask questions and feel comfortable. We find those very useful. Bruce, I think that might be the last slide.
I think you're right. That's the last slide. So I don't know if there's any questions. George, Phil?
Bruce, I think our appetite is more than whetted. If anybody was paying attention, you know that there's going to be a guidance document that's going to be coming out that's going to be subject to a lot of discussion. And I think this is a perfect entree to that, to causing us to keep our antenna up and notice what the department's going to do with this guidance document. I suspect that there'll be a lot of demand for instruction, and I hope that SEEP is able to respond to that. I know SEEP will be responding to that. I think that you raise so many interesting subjects. First of all, the variability becoming, I live right next to the Delaware River. In New Jersey, I have to clean up sites to 10 to the -6 for cancer risk. I go across the river, I have 10 to the -5. You know, there's a lot of variation. And when you start to think about what that means in terms of exposure scenarios, and by the way, Bruce, that's not a DEP mandate, that's a statute mandate. That's in the law. So DEP can't even change that. But yet you look at people, places for guidance, and EPA and the National Contingency Plan says, well, evaluating risk is 10 to the -4 to 10 to the -6, depending upon site-specific circumstance. So there's a lot of variation in that, and how we come up with our levels of risk are all driven by that, at least in New Jersey right now. Phil, do we have any questions?
Yeah, let me interrupt you for 1 second. So a question came up. Where does the OHSA Silica standard fit in here?
You know, as an ex-OSHA guy, I can answer that question. So in the world of meeting the various regulations, OSHA Silica standard is focused on the OSHA or the silica exposures to workers, and all the aspects that are that need to be handled with regards to keeping the concentrations of silica down, making sure you have a respiratory protection program, and all the things in the standard. Where often it stops in many people is what's the silica exposure to the people off site. And that's where a lot of the construction operations that are dealing with silica really haven't addressed the offsite impact, because there's been no driving regulatory pressure to say you also have to meet certain thresholds of making sure silica is not being exposed to whoever the sensitive receptors are next door. And this is where Deb's information comes in, where you start looking at the silica exposure, which is quite low actually for a worker standard, and what would be the corresponding public health risk threshold that has to be met off-site, which would even be lower.
Right.
So it's independent, you know, as a contractor, construction person, you have to deal with the OSHA requirements. But now the question is, from a construction standpoint, where do contractors and construction activities also have to deal with public health risk issues?
Yeah, and I would just add to what Bruce is saying, often on our sites, we have to distinguish those two. You know, what could be generated at a construction site, and then what's background. So it's important that that EPA's criteria is different, it's lower. And so your monitoring program, you want to make sure what's emanating from your site is appropriately EPA risk, and you can look at what's coming on your site and what's upwind, and so it makes it more of a complex issue to understand where the exposures might be coming from.
Thanks. That was a question. Any other questions from our attendees?
Joe, I have a question when you're done with the attendees.
Well, why don't you ask it now?
Bruce, Deb, DEP now has indoor air standards. I asked the question recently if that comported with the Department of Health indoor standard. The enabling legislation for DEP does not include indoor environments except when a source from an external environment causes indoor air problems. What do you think about DEP creating their own indoor air quality standards?
Well, it's I think there's a kind of a struggle between DEP and DOH. They try to get on the same board when they're mutually looking at a media, whether it be drinking water or indoor air, and that's always kind of been a struggle. But if you look at what DEP did, they basically are the EPA risk-based indoor air criteria. They didn't go off and do their own, which some states have, but so at least they're really trying to align themselves and be in sync with EPA. And as you had mentioned, they are bound chemical by chemical at a 10⁻⁶ level. So there is differences between EPA, as you mentioned, and New Jersey DEP for the risk levels. And
Right.
Unfortunately, EPA, New Jersey DEP is basically stuck with the 10⁻⁶ risk. And so those indoor air criteria they've come up with really puts you in a position where you might have to address background, what's actually in the ambient air, but what might be emanating from building materials, for example, as we talked earlier about what's incense borne in an indoor air, and you have to be able to tease those out and understand what the source is and be able to match those two criteria. And if you're exceeding a 10⁻⁶ criteria in indoor air, you're going to have to address that and mitigate it. But technically, it's they're on fairly sound ground. They're not forging on their own, but are trying to line themselves up with EPA, and they're not developing their own toxicity factors. They're using EPA's.
Yeah, and I'm not a lawyer, but I will tell you, and this is not a board's opinion, I'm still on the board for the next until the next 20 some days. I would say that if you cannot demonstrate a complete pathway between the external environment and the impact on the air quality, DEP standards do not apply. That would be my personal opinion. You do revert back to DOH standards. So at any rate,
George, can I just follow up on what Deb just said? I just have a question, because I know during the proposal process, there was a lot of requests for background and basis on those standards, and a lot of experts, and I'm not an air expert, who basically said they were having a hard time duplicating the numbers the department was putting out, and asked for the scientific background, and they were sent a 3-line letter that basically said no. You just said it is consistent with EPA. I mean, are there still questions as to how consistent they are?
it's frustrating. And even though there's actually differences. If you took EPA 10 to the -6 risk level for benzene and a New Jersey DEP 10 to the -6 risk, there's going to be a difference. And what New Jersey DEP say is they're rounding, and they have actually a document on how they round. And so a lot of it could be difference in rounding. And a lot of it is also subtle differences where they, instead of said exposure duration of 250 days or 325 days, there's some subtle differences in what New Jersey has established as exposure versus EPA. So it's confusing, to be frank. And but you know, if you really think about it, these differences are small. They're not an order of magnitude by any means. But they're just confusing to people that don't want to delve into the details. But they're, you know, still they're on a technically sound basis and fairly consistent with EPA.
So welcome to New Jersey.
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions coming in. It is now 9:01. Bruce or Deb, anything you want to close before I know George gives you a big thank you?
No, I think we can wait for George's thank you, but it's been a pleasure.
Yep, thank
And
you.
obviously, any sort of follow-up information, the slides will be available, as Phil said. And I'm sure we'll have more information when this guidance document comes out at the end of the beginning of next year. So.
George?
Before I say thank you, I do want to give a couple of notes to your LSRPs in the world out there who are listening. First of all, you heard something about environmental justice. You heard something about perimeter air monitoring. This is going to be added on to all the documents and all the laws and all the regulations that we have in our purview that we must certify all of our work conforms to. And that means, as a profession, you need to stay current. It means it's never ending. It will continue to change. It will continue to evolve, and you need to evolve with it. That's what we're all about. That's why we offer these hot topics. That's why we offer our courses. For example, how many people know that there's a new AAI standard that ASTM just put out that replaces the 2013 document? EPA has not blessed it yet, but they will. So my point simply is, because of people like Bruce and Deb, who are willing to give of their time and efforts to keep us current, to make sure that we are the professionals that everybody wants us to be, and hopefully that's self-imposed. I want to thank you so much for your time and your willingness to cooperate and put on this program. No money changes hands on these hot topics. And that we do it because we think we should do it, because it's a service to the profession. Bruce, Deb, thank you so much. Happy holidays. Be safe, be healthy, and everybody out there, the same to you.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody, and please have a safe and happy holiday season, and hopefully see you again soon.